This is the autobiography of Michael Peters. I was born Michael Arthur Peters in Tunbridge Wells on the 14th of April 1933. It was snowing at the time, so I'm told. I didn't know anything about it. My parents were Joseph and Mary. I had one brother, Patrick, always referred to as Pat, and we lived on the outskirts of Tunbridge Wells, generally considered to be a very classy sort of area, but in fact some parts of the town were quite poverty-stricken. There were some roads behind us where people were certainly not well off at all. Our family home had always been in Hawley, but about 2 years before I was born, I think, my parents moved to Tunbridge Wells and took on a corner shop. The area that we were in, Bay Hall Road, was a very respectable road running through to Hawkenbury and then eventually, if you sat with it long enough, down to the coast. But some of the roads at the back of our shop were really poverty-stricken. And there was another little corner shop close by. There was a butcher's, off licence, and four pubs. All the four pubs, I think, were never more than about 100 yards apart from each other. So it was quite an interesting area. The shop itself had a front entrance and a back entrance. The front entrance opened onto Bay Hall Road, the respectable part. The back entrance opened onto some of the smaller streets. There was a peculiar little shoe shop next to our shop. I can't imagine that they sold all that many shoes in that area, but there we are. The shop itself was quite large. It was the usual sort of corner shop things which we sold. If you stood at the counter, you had below the counter several large drawers containing some of the articles on sale. Particularly I remember cigarettes, which were sometimes in short supply. So were reserved for certain customers who would always be able to tell you just where you could find them. And if you were standing there facing those drawers, behind you was a large bank of small drawers, each one very carefully labelled with what should be inside. Mind you, you probably didn't find what it said on the label because the contents did vary quite enormously. If you went out through the back of the shop, you came to a large storeroom with a cellar underneath, which was very seldom ventured into. If you went out beyond that, you went through a small dairy, because besides delivering newspapers, we also sold and delivered milk. It used to come to us in churns, and we would then put it into bottles, pint bottles or half-pint bottles, I seem to remember. And then beyond the dairy was the outside cobbled area, the backyard, which then opened out onto the side street. Going back into the building itself, off the storeroom were the living quarters. Just up a couple of steps brought you into the main living room, quite a large room, with actually 5 doors going off it. First the one which you would have come through coming out from the storeroom, and then was one door led through to the front room, which was only used Christmas or other very special occasions. Then there was a pantry which had yet another cellar below it. Another door leading upstairs to the bedrooms, and another one leading through into what was called the little kitchen where the cooking was done. If you went out through the little kitchen, you came to the scullery with running water, but only cold running water, until, well, I think it was when I was about 12, we did get some hot water dispenser installed. During the war years, we had a Morrison shelter in this scullery. That was the metal sort which you could crawl into if there was an air raid at night, well, in particular at night, which was large enough to take my brother and me and mother. Dad would never come downstairs anyway if there was an air raid. If you went out beyond that area, you came to the back door, so if you turned left, you went past the well, which was no longer in use by this time. But there must have been some little stream or something running underneath it, because things did gradually disappear down it and get taken away. In later years, this was sealed over with a concrete top to prevent anybody else falling down. I think on one occasion, I think it was a rabbit that had fallen down, but was rescued with the aid of a basket on the end of a piece of string. That then took you around and out to the backyard. We had a small car, Austin 7, I think about the time I was born, actually, the early 1930s, which I learnt to drive on. Now, going back to the back door, if instead of going to the left you'd branched off to the right, after about 50 yards, I suppose, you came to the rabbit hutches on your left. The rabbits weren't kept as pets. They were there either for meat or for making Mother a fur coat. She bred chinchillas at one time and had a fur coat made. The only trouble was the dog would always follow her around. Past the rabbit hutches, you came to the coal store and the outside toilet. The toilet was a simple bench type with, if you were lucky, a supply of toilet paper. If you weren't, it didn't really matter too much because there was always plenty of newspaper available. So coming back indoors, if we go back to the main living room again, if you wanted to go upstairs, there was a door at the bottom of the stairs, rather winding stairs, which took you up to 4 bedrooms, which were all interconnecting. So if you went off to the left-hand side, you came to the main building, which Mum and Dad always occupied. That led through to a back bedroom, which I know at one time Pat and I had shared. From that you could go through to the bottom of another flight of stairs, which took you up to the attic, which was hardly used at all apart from storing apples. And then you could go round into the 3rd bedroom and through that into the 4th bedroom, which would lead you back to the top of the stairs. I know at one point we had a lodger, a little old lady, I forget what her name was now, so she had, I'm not sure whether it was just one room at the top of the stairs or probably 2 at the bedrooms. So that was the layout of the shop itself. It was a wooden building made of Kent weatherboard. It was quite common in that part of the country. But it was heated, all the shop area at least was heated by Valla oil stoves, and really if one of those had got knocked over, which wouldn't have been too difficult, the whole place would have just gone up in flames. Now, as I say, we sold newspapers and delivered newspapers. We were very lucky in that there was a family by the name of Branch lived a few doors further up, not very well off, several children, and they always seemed to be able to supply us with paper boys or even paper girls, which was almost unheard of in those days. And I know Mum used to provide them with breakfast very often because they weren't very well off. I didn't normally deliver newspapers because the Branch family coped very well, but just occasionally I would get called out. And I remember on one occasion I was probably about 20 years old at the time. I just started teaching, and there was some emergency with the paper delivery, so I got called out. And I was halfway down one of the roads, and I suppose I put the wrong paper in, and a woman came to the door and shouted after me, "Yeah, paper boy," which I wasn't quite used to as I just started teaching, was really getting used to addressed as sir rather than paper boy. So that was the building itself. As I say, I had one brother, Pat, and we went to school at St. Peter's School, which was only about 3 or 4 minutes walk away. Typical Victorian parish school. The church never seemed to get very much involved in it. It was a typical Victorian building with 6 classrooms for junior to infant. The only odd thing about its layout was that the playground didn't adjoin the school. It was 2 or 3 minutes walk down the road before you got to it. So if there was an air raid warning, remembering that this was during the war, when Pat and I were growing up, a lot of it was wartime. So if there was an air raid siren, you'd got to get yourself down to the playground where a shelter had been built. Not forgetting your gas masks. So I think if there had been a gas attack, I would probably have been killed because my gas mask never fitted properly. There was always a gap around the side. The school itself was not outstanding really in any way. It was just typical of its time. The staff were, on the whole, fairly elderly, I suppose. The head was Mr. Wilmot. He also happened to be the organist and choirmaster of King Charles Church, which was right down the bottom end of the town, about a mile away. And he got me involved with the choir at the church. I suppose I would have been about 8 at the time. I remember I had to sing All Things Bright and Beautiful for him as a trial piece. Only he played a different tune to the one I was used to. But anyway, I got in, and I was associated with King Charles Church until I left the Tunbridge Wells area when I was about 20. Going back to the school, now it's another thing perhaps that I can remember all the members of staff, and I think all their names, and yet, having been a teacher myself, I sometimes ask ex-pupils if they remember the staff, and they're not as good at it as I am. They were quite reasonable, fairly elderly women, apart from the head, and one other man, Mr. Hughes, who took the top year, who was one to be feared. The cane was in frequent use at this time in some schools, not so much in St. Peter's until you got to Mr. Hughes' class. My brother Pat tended to get into more scrapes than I did and got caned fairly frequently. And I remember he said afterwards that he was always a bit annoyed because there was a little girl in his classroom, in his class, who happened to live not far from the shop. So if he got caned, on her way home she'd always go into the shop and say to Mum or Dad, "Pat got caned again today." Not that I think it bothered them very much one way or the other. When you got to the age of 11 at this time, you took the scholarship exam, which meant that if you passed the scholarship you could get free education at the local grammar school, which was Skinner's. Now, Pat took that exam when he was 11. He did not pass, but he went to King Charles School, which was the school attached to the church that I've just referred to, and he did very well there. It was a good school, and he went on to a technical college and finished up working for APV in Crawley. Now, I think my parents were particularly keen that I should get to the grammar school. I think they thought I was rather more academic than Pat was. So they took me away from St. Peter's when I was 10 and paid for me to go to Skinner's for that last year between 10 and 11. I did pass the scholarship exam when I became 11 at Skinner's, and so that meant I could go on being educated after the age of 11 free of charge. The school, Skinner's, was a grammar school created by the Skinner's Company, which, as the name implies, dealt in furs, and had set up 3 schools in the area. There was Skinner's, the grammar school in Tunbridge Wells, and then about 5 miles away in Tunbridge there was Judd's School, which was the equivalent grammar school, and also Tunbridge School, which was a public school, so it was certainly one step up from Skinner's or Judd's, but the Skinner's Company supported all 3. And some quite well-known cricketers, in fact, went to Tunbridge School, including the Cowdrey family. So I started at Skinner's School. Nothing terribly spectacular about it. It was quite a straightforward, ordinary grammar school. We worked a 5.5-day week. There was school on Saturday mornings, and 1.5 day was taken up by games. So there was rugby in the autumn term and the first half of the spring term. The second half of the spring term it changed to cross country, and then changed again to cricket in the summer term. And then there was one afternoon a week which was devoted to army cadets. Well, for most of the school it was army cadets. It was originally the Officers' Training Corps, and then later became the Combined Cadet Force. And then for some of the younger years there were scout troops. There was 3 scout troops, And for the very small boys, like me when I was 10, was a little cub pack. And all these things, well, one always assumed that they were compulsory, which would be unusual for things like scout troops, but there we are. The staff at Skinner's were fairly elderly, largely because this was wartime, or most of the time I was there, the earlier period. The staff were elderly because the younger men had been moved into the Army, Air Force or Navy. So we had older men, apart from Mr. Phillips, Pips, who was a Quaker and therefore also a conscientious objector. People for whom I have the greatest admiration because they would refuse to kill but would happily take an ambulance up to the front line. So those were the men. And then, horror of horrors, I'm sure, for many people, there were actually a few women drafted in. And for women to teach in a boys' grammar school at this time was certainly unheard of. Some of the younger ones I think we played Merry Hell with, and they didn't last very long. But there were two, Mrs. Wellman, who took physics, and Miss Jones, who took Latin, who really were brilliant and did extremely well and stayed on after the war. And in fact, it must have been about 1950 when I was about 18 years old. They took a group of us to Switzerland for a school journey. Now really that was quite unheard of. It wasn't all that many years after the war. And for women teachers to take teenage boys, a group of about 16 of us I think, right across by boat and by train to Switzerland was an incredible achievement, but they were brilliant, those two. The men all had a common room in the main building. You couldn't see across it from one side to the other for smoke, for cigarette smoke, pipe smoking. It was quite thick. Actually, the prefects, who would have been sort of 18-year-olds, most of them, who had their own little private room as well, was nearly as bad. You could scarcely see across that for smoke either, which shows how things have changed since those days. And I know in my last year at Skinner's, I was very friendly with the head boy, Peter Barker, and I know his fingers were always brown from nicotine. The women, of course, weren't allowed into the main common room. They had their own private little building, actually close to the prefect's area. A few years ago, my brother and I wrote a little book in conjunction with one of our neighbours, which we called Growing Up in St. Peter's. And my brother's wife edited it for us, and I gave her an article, I remember, for it on one occasion, including all the nicknames of the staff, and she said, you can't possibly publish that, which will be held up for libel, because there were some quite rude names. There was another thing, what you called people. Okay, we had nicknames for all the staff. We had nicknames for most of the boys. You would never call another boy by his Christian name unless you were very close friends with him. But normally we were called by our surnames or by nicknames. Discipline wasn't particularly tight. I think the masters themselves took the view that they weren't there to keep discipline, they were there to teach their subject, and somebody else had got to look after the discipline side of it, so that was left to the prefects, who would, as I say, have been mainly 18, some 19-year-olds. There was an active house system. The school was divided into 4 houses, so there were things like inter-house matches, but also house points. So in each form room there would be a notice listing all the boys in that form, and then after that there would be columns. The first column was for G's, standing for good work. Second column was for B's, which meant you'd lost a house point for bad work. The third column was for D's, which was for disorder, which was for things like messing around in class. So every half term, all the prefects came round and collected up all the house points for their particular house, and then a few days later there would be a house meeting in which various things like house matches would be discussed, but also if you'd lost house points you would be required to stand up and try to excuse yourself or say what had happened. And if you'd lost more than 2 house points, you were in trouble, because the next Monday morning a list would go up on the prefect's notice board, which would say something like, the following boys will report to the prefect's room at 1 o'clock on Friday, and give the dates, and then would be a list. So you were looked at trepidation for that, because although the prefects didn't have the right to cane you, they did have the right to whack you very hard with the large gym slipper. So any miscreants who got into trouble in any way had to report to the prefect's room and were duly lined up outside the prefect's room and called in one at a time to be beaten. So, as I say, the discipline wasn't all that tight. It was quite a relaxed atmosphere, really. So much, I think, for Skinner's. By the time I got to the age of about 18 or 19, I should have left really at 18, but I failed my higher school certificate miserably and stayed on an extra year and didn't do very much better. But 3 or 4 of us to get involved at that time, when we were about 18, with the local TOC H movement. Now, TOC H was founded by, what was her name, Tubby Clayton, I think, in the First World War. It was an organisation really for ex-servicemen, so quite why we got involved in it I can't remember. But I do know that the local TOC H branch used to hold rallies at a place called the Isle of Thorns, which wasn't an island at all, but was out in Ashdown Forest, and was a large expanse of land with some hutted accommodation, huge swimming pool, and camping field and playing fields, and we would hold rallies, TOC H rallies out there, and I think it was out there too that we had camps for boys from the East End of London. And I remember on one occasion, for some reason or other, my best friend Peter Barker, who I've mentioned before, who was the school captain, got involved in organising the entertainment for one of these rallies. And I don't know how we had the nerve, I think it was Peter rather than me, but we had discovered that Jimmy Edwards, who was a very popular comedian at the time, lived only about 5 miles away from the Isle of Thorns, a village called Fletching, I think. And somehow or other we found out the exact house where he lived in the village. So one Sunday morning we cycled out from Tunbridge Wells, distance of about 15 miles, I suppose, and just knocked on his door. And when he came, looking slightly dishevelled, to the front door, asked him if he would come and entertain at the Toc-H rally. He was quite polite, but certainly not interested. But we had the nerve to do these things in those days, I don't know. So, from Skinner's, well, I remember one week I had a driving test and my medical for national service both occurred during the same week. I failed the medical test for the services, for which I was quite relieved, so I did not have to do national service, which was beginning to be phased out a bit by then anyway. But I passed my driving test to my delight, and as I mentioned before, we had this little Austin 7 on which I learnt to drive. Conditions for driving were a bit different in those days. Not quite as different as when my mother started driving. She never took tests because tests hadn't been introduced when she started driving. She never could get into reverse, so she always had to plan all her journeys going forwards the whole time. And Dad used to use the car for doing deliveries, I think to people who had lived near us in St. Peter's and then moved to different parts of the town, but for some reason he would still deliver groceries to them once a week. And sometimes I would go out with him, perhaps when I was about 14, 15 onwards. And if he was driving and suddenly decided he wanted a cigarette, he would then get ready to light a cigarette and say, just hold on to the steering wheel for a minute while I light my cigarette. And it's surprisingly difficult when you're in your sort of mid-teens and you've never driven a car to actually steer it from the passenger seat. Fortunately, we never had any accidents in any way. And the little old car did us great. So, I left Skinner's and because I wasn't going in for national service, I had a year on my hands. I knew by this time I wanted to go in for teaching, but I couldn't have got into a training college at short notice then. So I decided to try to get some unqualified teaching. There was the divisional education office was in Tunbridge Wells, so I went down to the divisional education office and explained the situation and said, had they got any jobs? And there was a shortage of teachers at that time. So yes, they were quite happy to offer me a job. They said there was a job at a boys' secondary school at a place called Swatendon, down in Kent, between Cranbrook and Hawkhurst. and I was assured that all I had to do was just keep 2 pages ahead of the rest of the boys in the class. That should be no problem at all. So it was, I suppose, late September, even yes, late September, early October perhaps, when I actually started. The term had started a few weeks before, so when I opened the registers, there's a special book in which you put absences, and for several pages it lists all the boys who've been absent, and by the side of nearly all of them it just said hopping, 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 indicating that the boys had been roped in to go hop picking rather than come to school, which probably suited them very well. Probably the most notable thing about this school, which was a boys' secondary, situated right out in the country. It was been an old mansion in its own grounds with some modern buildings attached. I suppose probably about 15 miles, something like that, from Tunbridge Wells. So I used to catch the 33 bus, which was only about a quarter of a mile from where I was living at the shop, and I can still remember all the bus routes and the bus route numbers and where they went to, which is incredible. I may not be able to remember what I had for breakfast. So I would catch the 33 bus at 7:30 in the morning. That would take me through to the little village of Goudhurst. That journey took, I suppose, about half an hour. I had about half an hour to wait in Goudhurst before I could pick up the school bus, which would then take me all the way into the school. Now that was straightforward. The boys on that bus were quite a reasonable crowd. They'd always had a member of staff supervising it anyway, so that was no problem. The journey coming home was very different and difficult, because there were no suitable connections for getting home the way I had come. So I decided that I would have to go out, catch a different school bus out to Hawkhurst, from whence I could get a service bus which would take me back into Tunbridge Wells. The area had been known in previous centuries as an area for smuggling, and when you came off the Romney Marsh area and got up towards Hawkhurst. And there was a particularly vicious and nasty gang called the Hawkhurst Gang. And I swear that a lot of the boys who rode on that bus back to Hawkhurst were descendants from the Hawkhurst Gang, because they really were an awful lot. They had no staff on the bus. It was a ramshackle old bus. They were absolutely packed into it like sardines, so I did not enjoy my journeys back from Swatenden. Anyway, I survived my year's unqualified teaching at Swatenden, and in the meantime I had applied for a place at King Alfred's Training College in Winchester, which was a 2-year course in those days. So I took the English and history courses there. Really enjoyable 2 years it was as well. Thoroughly enjoyed that. We had teaching practices from which we were assessed. As I say, I had specialised in English and history, and our history tutor, Mr. Shipley, was a great character, a wizened little soul, terribly interested, particularly in prehistory. And he got me interested in prehistory as well. And the area was quite well known for its prehistory sites, burial mounds and that kind of thing. I had several friends there that I kept in touch with for many years afterwards, particularly Ron de la Cruz, who was originally of Spanish descent, and I used to see him once a year until he died about 5 or 6 years ago. He lived in Liverpool. I used to go up to Liverpool and just be with him for the day. He spent most of his life at the Royal School for the Blind in Liverpool. He was a brilliant character and an amazing mimic. He could just mimic absolutely anybody at all. I didn't think anybody could mimic my voice, but he did. And yes, we kept in touch for many years. So I finished the 2-year course at King Alfred's College, and then started looking for a teaching post. I decided I wanted to stay in the Kent area, so I looked at the vacancy lists and decided to try one at on the Isle of Sheppey at Sheerness, that is off the on the Kent coast. So this was Miletown, which was a boys' junior school, which was a little bit unusual. Now Sheerness was very much linked with the Navy. There's a big dockyard there, so nearly everybody seemed to work at the dockyard, and the co-op was very prevalent. Apart from the co-op shops which were there was a co-op hall. There was even a co-op orchestra which I played in actually at one time, so I used to play the cello and the piano. So I put in my application and got appointed there, and went to, I got digs about a mile from the school. In those days it was quite common, if you were on your own, to go into digs, where today people might get a flat, share a flat. In those days, just going into digs was handy. So I went in with one couple who had a teenage boy. She was a beautiful cook, absolutely brilliant. Unfortunately, eventually they moved away, and I moved in with another couple, an older couple. He had been in the Navy, had been all around the world, he'd seen poverty all over the world. And one phrase I always remember, their name was Williamson. If his wife, Mrs. Williamson, started complaining about anything, the price of meat or shortage of bananas or something, he would say to her, "My dear, every morning when you get out of bed, you should fall down on your knees and thank the Lord that you live in England." The school itself was quite close to the sea, and I had during my first year there, for part of it, I had a class of 49. In those days that wasn't all that unusual, but they were certainly pretty well packed in like sardines. Well, after I had been at the school for about 3 weeks, I'd made up my mind that I was just going to stick it out till Christmas, and then I was going to leave and look for a job elsewhere. Because the head, Mr. Ponton, was an incredible character. He simply tore all my teaching notes to pieces and said it was quite useless. His staff meetings were incredible. He would just gather the staff after school, come in, tear everybody's teaching to pieces, say how awful everybody was, and in the meantime the deputy, Spud Taylor, was standing there getting redder and redder in the face, and then Mr. Ponton would just storm out, and that would be it. Nobody else said anything. So I thought, well, I really cannot put up with this. And then one day I was in my classroom after school, and Mr. Ponton came into the room, and I happened to have on my desk some aerial photographs of prehistoric sites, burial mounds, that sort of thing. After that I could do no wrong, because he was an ardent archaeologist. He was in fact very high up in the Kent Archaeological Society. And everything changed then, and I stayed on. There were in fact 3 of us who were quite interested in archaeology, and helped him with a dig which he did over in Milton near Sittingbourne one summer holiday. Didn't find anything very spectacular. Now it's funny, now I have taught thousands of children in my time, and sometimes they come up to me, past pupils come up to me, or their parents come up to me and say, "Do you remember me?" And quite often I'm afraid I've taught so many and my memory is now so bad that either I try to pretend I do or admit that I don't. But it's always the awful ones that you do remember. And perhaps the most awful one that I ever taught was Arthur Full James. You see, I still remember him after all these years. And Arthur was an absolute pain in the neck. He was always in trouble. Nothing really vicious or unpleasant, but just always trouble. And the cane was in constant use at Miletown. Virtually all the staff caned boys. And I caned Arthur Full James. The head caned Arthur Full James, and it made no difference whatsoever. I have wondered ever since whether he had some medical condition which meant that he didn't feel pain, or didn't feel it very much. I know there is such a condition, which is very unfortunate for people, because they're quite likely to burn themselves if they pick up something hot without realising it. But no, nothing made any difference to Arthur. I often wonder what happened to him. And then one day the head had the bright idea that we could take all of the top year to Portsmouth for the day. So I was dreading this. I thought, my God, I've got Arthur Full James, I've got to have him close to me somewhere from the moment we leave Sheerness station to the moment we get back in the evening. It's going to be awful. So we all got into the train in Sheerness, and I had Arthur Full James sitting not very far away from me in a window seat. He was absolutely no trouble at all. All day he was a delight to be with. But whether he just didn't like the classroom atmosphere or what it was, I don't know. That was the only time he was ever a real pleasure to have with you. While I was there, I was the only one on the staff that could play the piano, so it was up to me to play hymns for assembly and that kind of thing. And talking of music, the BBC produced some very good programmes in this period. One called, what was it, Rhythm and Melody or something like that. And I know one autumn term it ran a series of programmes featuring the opera, children's opera, Hansel and Gretel by Engelbert, Hamperdink. This is the original Engelbert, Hamperdink, not the more recent one, who took its name. And they were very good. And then I discovered, it must have been sort of halfway through the autumn term, that the Sadler's Wells Opera Company was putting on a production of Hansel and Gretel at Sadler's Wells Theatre. So I decided it would be a good idea to take a group up to London for that. Now this is the sort of thing you wouldn't be able to do today. So I just took them up on my own. I think I took about 12 of them. They would have been sort of 11-year-old boys. So we went up by train. I can't remember quite what we did in the morning, whether we did anything. So as we must have. And then we got a bus across the Sadler's Wells Theatre. And I always remember the conductor came round. I got these 12 boys with me, and I said, 1 and 12 halves to Sadler's Wells, please. And the conductor, a cockney, just said, "Cor blimey, mate, hasn't the missus got the strength to come out tonight then?" Anyway, that went quite well. It's another example of things which have changed over the years, the ability to just do that off the cuff. So things went on in Sheerness, and I stayed there for, 5 years, and then eventually decided that I did need a change of scenery. So I was looking around for a mixed secondary school, which I hadn't done before. I'd done boys' secondary, I'd done junior, mixed and boys. And I found a post advertised for Rootham, which was a mixed comprehensive. Again, one rather out in the country, halfway between Barrow Green and Rootham. So I applied for that and got the job. And that was for English and history. And it was there that I met Elizabeth. Elizabeth was the head of English at Rootham, and she was also very interested in history, so we used to get together and do quite a number of school trips, youth hosteling and that sort of thing. And eventually, a few years later, when I had moved back to Horley, she moved in with me, and we were together, I suppose, for about 25 years. And I'll come back to that later. So, yes, I worked in Rootham at the comprehensive there, which again was quite different. As I say, I was really appointed for English and history, but you always seemed to get landed with jobs which you weren't particularly qualified for. And unfortunately, the music master there, Bill Rush, was absolutely brilliant. Was taken ill, in fact died, and I was the only one on the staff who could play the piano at all, so I got landed in taking on some of the music there. So, after a couple of years there, I decided to make another move. I hadn't been that happy there. It was all right. And so, my parents were living in the family home in Hawley. My father wasn't too good. They had given up the shop in Tunbridge Wells. I think it went bankrupt, in fact. And my mother was getting very ill, so I decided to move back to the family home. And so I moved from Rootham, where I've been in digs, the post office at Ightham, and looked around the Hawley area to see what might attract me. Well, again, this is a bit like the Jimmy Edwards episode. I don't know how I had the nerve to do this, but I saw a job advertised at Pound Hill Junior in Crawley. Now, somehow or other, I managed to discover the private address of the headmaster there, Sam Rack. So I think that was a Sunday morning. Yes, that would have been a Sunday morning. I went round to his house, just knocked on the door. His wife came to the door, and I said, is it possible to have a word with Mr. Ragg? I'm thinking of applying for a job at the school. He said, oh yes, come in. Sam's in the garden at the moment, but he'd be delighted to be interrupted. So I went in, sat down, Sam came in, and we sat there for a couple of hours just talking education. He was the best head I ever taught under. He really was brilliant. He was just so enthusiastic about everything. So I started working at Pound Hill. A very pleasant area on the outskirts of Crawley. Actually, Gareth Southgate, the present England football manager, went there as a boy. That was long after my time, but I do in fact know somebody, John Little, who had Gareth Southgate in his class later on. Yes, Sam was, as I say, a great headmaster, very encouraging and always full of ideas. One thing I remember about my time there was that come the end of the autumn term, there was always a party for the top year. So they had this party, they had the food, and then there was always entertainment by the staff. The staff would put on a pantomime of some kind, or something similar. And the idea was they would have the food, and then I would be left by the rest of the staff while they went and put on their costumes and things, and I did a bit of community singing with the children just to entertain them till the staff were all ready. And I know one year it must have been the time when the Beatles were popular, because 4 of us, including Sam, dressed up as the Beatles and did a performance. I'm still in touch with Mary, who was one of the staff there. We speak on the phone sort of about every couple of weeks, and she was reminding me the other day of the fact that things had changed a bit regarding relationship with the boys and girls, because she said, did I remember at one time she and I both were teaching the same year, so when it came to a game session she taught the girls netball while I was teaching the boys football, and 2 of the girls said could they play football with the boys. Well, that was all right by Mary. I had no objection, and the boys didn't seem to mind. So these 2 girls came over and played football with the boys. I think they only did it once because the parents came up to the school and complained, which just seemed a bit unfortunate, but there we are. There was another occasion too regarding the girls. Bill Palmer, who was the acting head the first year I was there, because Sam was doing some work on a course, and he had started the tradition of putting on an Easter play for assembly, and after he left I took on that, and I kept it up for the rest of my teaching career, of doing a sort of simple passion play. And so I was always looking out in the earlier part of the year for somebody who would, a boy presumably, who would take the path to Christ. And you could usually find somebody who was suitable, but one year I couldn't see any boy who would really fit this, but one of the girls was just right, so I had a girl playing Jesus Christ, which raised a few eyebrows, but yeah, her name was Sylvia Quayle, but she was absolutely just right for the job. So soon after I started at Pound Hill, I started there at the beginning of the autumn term, naturally. My mother died just before the end of that term, leaving my father on his own for me to look after. He wasn't really good. He had problems and finished up in Netherland Hospital, and died 2 years later. After 6 years there, Pound Hill, I was looking around for another job. I just wanted a change. It wasn't that I was unhappy at Pound Hill, but I was looking in Horley and noticed that there was an advertisement for a maths teacher at Meath Green in Horley. And I didn't really take any notice of this because maths was not my subject, English and history were my subjects, so I didn't apply. But I had got very much involved with the local Oxfam group after I moved to Horley, and one thing we used to do was have an Oxfam week around Easter time, in which we encouraged schools to put on things like sponsored events, sponsored spells, sponsored walks, sponsored silences, that was a real money spinner. That was sponsored silence. The children would say they would like to be sponsored for every quarter of an hour they could keep quiet. Well, all their relations thought that their little darlings wouldn't keep quiet for more than about a few minutes, so they sponsored them quite heavily and then get caught out, because we would start this sponsor silence, I think it was 10 o'clock in the morning, and you would still have a few left by the time we finished at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So that was a real money spinner. We did all sorts of sponsored events. And one thing which happened during that week was that we got an Oxfam speaker to go around to the schools. His name was Frank Carter, and he lives near Leatherhead. Very devoted, very hard-working man, who used to travel all over England, but didn't drive, didn't have a car, went everywhere by public transport or by catching lifts from people. And one year I was acting as his driver, and took him round to 2 or 3 schools in Hawley. And one of the schools I took him to was Meath Green, and so I dropped him off there and left him to do his speaking there, and then arranged a call back for him an hour later or whatever it may have been. And when I went back and picked him up, when he got into the car, he said, "Oh, the head there said, that chap who drove you, he's not a teacher by any chance, is he?" So Frank said, "Yes, he is actually." So the head said, "Not looking for a job, is he?" So Frank said, "Well, I don't know." So Frank said to me, "You're not looking for a job, are you?" So I said, "Well, yes, I am, sort of." And I saw that there was a job posted here, but maths isn't my subject, so I didn't apply for it. Oh, well, I went to see the head, Mr. Tuller, and he said, "Oh, well, that's no problem. We don't have to be good at maths for this, I just want somebody to do various things around." So I put in an application and got the job. And I remember at the interview, one question was, "Are you prepared to teach all subjects for your own class?" And so I said, "Yes, that was fine by me. The only thing was, sports were not my forte, so I really didn't want to get involved with a lot of sport, just perhaps with my own year." So Mr. Tuner said, "Oh, that's all right, no problem. I do all the sports. I take the school football team, school cricket team. Yes, no, don't need to do anything like that." And that worked pretty well. I think it was for about 6 weeks. And then he wasn't very well, and I got landed with taking the football. I finished up running the football team, running the cricket team, running cross-country, which was all great fun, really. I wasn't very good at it, but yes, particularly cricket we did pretty well. I got somebody actually from Sussex County Cricket Club, Pat Cale, to come and do some training for us. And we went down to Sussex and inter-schools competitions down at Sussex County Ground in Hove. So that was great fun, but it wasn't my special subject at all. Well, I stayed at Meath Green until I retired in 1996. Yes, I enjoyed my time there. There were great staff. The heads changed from time to time, but we coped with it all. And since I've retired, and a number of other staff have retired, we have kept in touch with each other, or has until recently, until the virus interfered. And there were actually 20 of us on the list, including one or two husbands and wives, who would meet about once a month. And the idea was originally to go for a walk. Walks did tend to get shorter and shorter, but usually we did a walk and a meal. Now, since the virus, this hasn't been possible, of course, but one of the members, Jenny Mills, has been very good in producing a newsletter which she sends out once a month. In fact, the latest one arrived only yesterday, and I think that's about, oh, I've got a copy of it here. Yes, this will be the 14th newsletter that she has produced. So she collects news from any of us who used to meet, and turns out this, what's this, four pages here, all of which I haven't read yet. So we are at least kept in touch to some extent. I did quite a lot of walks. I was interested in the local history, so I used to take my classes round, looking particularly at Victorian architecture all over Hawley. We did quite a lot of school journeys, and it was really partly, I think, because of this that one of my ex-pupils got in touch with me and put me on to doing this idea of an autobiography. We did school journeys, first of all down to Kent, to St Mary's Bay, which is near Dymchurch. In fact, very close to the Romney Hythe and Dymchurch Railway. And then we moved around a bit. We went up to Norfolk and stayed at a little place called Mundersley. And then we went west to more of the Bristol Bath area and had some very successful trips down there. In the meantime, I got very much involved with the local Oxfam group. I was on the committee that set up the Oxfam in Hawley Inn, which had been, I think, 1960, late 62 or early 63, very soon after I came to Hawley. We had a meeting mainly based on representatives from all the churches of the area, and we had at the vicarage, I remember, in Hawley, all quite casual actually, because I don't know quite how it worked out, but Reverend Torrens was the vicar at the time, and his wife got involved. And I remember that as we were doing the washing up, she said to me, well, if you like, I'll be the chairman and you can be the organising secretary, which I took on. So we started off just having Oxfam weeks, and just the occasional shop, which just one shop happened to become vacant, that we could move in perhaps for a few weeks. And then we started doing sponsored events of various kinds. We had this Oxfam week, in which we did, as I say, talks to the schools, house collections, street collections, clothing collections. Sponsored walks were a big thing as well. The local youth club had tried a walk from Brighton to Horley, and we went and helped out with refreshments. And the following year they decided they didn't want to repeat it, and so we took that on. It wasn't terribly popular with the police, because it involved taking, I think we had something like 275 walkers, mainly teenagers, who made their own way down to Brighton, started off from Brighton Pier and walked back to Horley straight up the A23. No wonder it wasn't terribly popular with the police. But in those days, I suppose it wasn't as busy. This was the 1960s. And there was a verge, more or less, all the way, until you got to Pease Pottage. And then there was a path halfway down the hill that changed across the road. And I remember I'd organised the marshalling, and I had put a very good member of our committee, Denise Playford, to cross all the walkers over the road at this point. Now, that wouldn't have been too bad. But unfortunately, it came on to rain hard, and everybody decided to come back from Brighton at the same time. And she had an awful time trying to get the walkers across the main road coming down Pease Pottage Hill. Anyway, we did that. As it was so unpopular with the police, we did change the route. And next we tried starting from Horley, but going up the A217 to Reigate, there's a footpath all the way, and then turning left when you got to Reigate and picking up a footpath going along the A25, and then when you get nearly into Dorking, branching off to the left and coming back through Newdigate, more or less cross country, which worked quite well. One year we did think we'd lost a girl on the way back, which was a bit worrying, because she didn't appear at the finishing point. So we had to investigate that and go round to the parents, only to discover that she hadn't bothered to go to the finishing point. She'd just gone straight home, which was a relief to everybody. After that, we decided that perhaps even that route wasn't as safe as it might have been. So we then changed to doing a walk based on Tilgate Park and mainly round the park. But yes, these were huge money spinners. In more recent years, we've had a permanent shop, which has worked very, very well, until unfortunately this virus came along, and the shop had to close. Most of the other charity shops have reopened, but unfortunately the Oxfam shop has closed for good. Not so much because of the virus, but because there couldn't be any agreement between Oxfam and the owner. I don't know the details of that, but unfortunately that meant the end of the Oxfam shop. I had been very much involved in that, on the book side of it. I used to do all the non-fiction books and most of the window displays, which were books, while Pat Harrington did a good job on the fiction side of it. And we had some brilliant people running it, mainly Mr. and Mrs. Box, David and Emmy, who he worked as the manager for several years, and their daughter Ursula is still in contact with me. In fact, she came to visit me only a few days ago. So yes, the Oxfam in Horley, I'm afraid, has finished, having started back in the 1960s. Once I retired, I had got time on my hands for, first of all, there was the garden. Elizabeth was living with me from, say, the 60s onwards for about 25 years. She was very keen on gardening. My grandparents' generation had set up a very good garden, a large garden. It was a semi-detached house, and the gardens ran out in both directions. And on our side, we had some very good apple trees, pear trees, quince, and we used to grow produce, Elizabeth and I, which we would sell off at a stall on the front of the house. People used to just put the money through the letterbox, and it worked perfectly well. We also had animals. My grandfather, who had originally started the process, kept pigs, which apparently he slaughtered just outside the back door. My ex-door neighbour, who lived to be 104, told me about it. And we had rabbits, we had ducks, which were bought at what was called point of lay, but they very seldom bothered to lay anything. We had geese, some very vicious geese, in fact. On one occasion I had to take one to the vet, which was quite a performance, because she got a growth under her beak, and so I rang the vet expecting him to come out, and he just said, "Oh, well, I'll bring her down and I'll have a look." So I had to get her into a large cardboard box, put it on the front seat of the van which I was driving at that time. And you get some rather peculiar looks when somebody sees that the head of a goose in the passenger seat. That yes, we kept quite a number of animals, and we had sheds, duck sheds, rabbit sheds, etc. Some of them made out of old school desks, and also railway sleepers, because my grandfather had worked on the railway. Perhaps that was where they got the sleepers from, I don't know. And I had a great aunt Lottie, who taught in Horley for 51 years. Actually, she was head of the infant school for 41 years. So she had connections with school, and some of the sheds were made from old school desks, or parts of them. So Elizabeth and I went on, and Made quite a bit of money, I suppose, out of the garden. Now, what I hadn't mentioned was that I was sort of half brought up by one of our neighbours in Tunbridge Wells. What had happened, apparently, was that I think a couple of years or so before I was born, my father had had a motorcycle accident and so wasn't so active. So it was quite a strain for my mother to look after us and to look after the shop and run the business. And there was a family, the Hamperdink family, lived a few doors down from us. And the daughter, May, was a piano teacher. And she used to come up and help in the shop. And then when things got a bit difficult, I suppose, and I was around, she started helping to look after me. So I finished being half brought up by the Tappentons. Unfortunately, Mr. Tappenden was killed during the war by a direct bomb on the premises. So I was partly brought up by May and partly by my parents. But I stayed in contact with May for the rest of her life, because I had said to her many years earlier, when you retire you can always come up and get a bungalow near me or something. Well, it turned out that in fact she came to live with me, and I finished up looking after her in the end. So I got involved in a lot of Oxfam work. Also I was involved in the Meals on Wheels organisation in Hawley. We used to deliver quite a number of meals around the area, and then eventually the funding was cut from that. So a small group of us went on delivering it privately. We used to get meals from Meath Green School kitchen. Our cook was very obliging, and just about half a dozen of us kept going with Meals on Wheels for a little while after that. When we had to give up finally, then I went over to Crawley and worked for Meals on Wheels in Crawley. And I also got involved in an organisation which provided a talking newsletter for the blind. So I used to do readings for them. And I was lucky enough to be awarded the MBE for my charitable work. That was instigated, I know, by David Box, our organiser at the Hawley shop. But really it is quite an event going to collect an award like that. It was done at Buckingham Palace by Prince Charles. And the organisation at Buckingham Palace, the precision with which everything is done is absolutely fantastic. So I was very lucky to get that. And in more recent years then, my health has gone down a bit, and so eventually I decided I would have to move into this care home in Hawley, which means everything is done for you, almost too much is done for you, and you're extremely well fed. It's also extremely expensive. It works out at about £1,400 per week, about which I feel very guilty because there are so many other uses to which the money could be put. I'm very lucky in that I've got, I haven't got any relations, close relations in Hawley itself now. There used to be 20 of us at one time, all related to each other, aunts and uncles and mothers and fathers, and actually I'm the last one. So I feel guilty about spending all this money on myself, but there it is. I have 3 surviving nephews, and one of them, Guy, who lives down in Somerset. He's kindly taking over all my affairs, and so I just leave all the finances to him. And he's very good. He travels up from Somerset from time to time. He's actually coming up on Monday, all being well. So there we are. I have probably missed out several things I should have put in, but yes, I didn't say Elizabeth eventually moved back down to Seaford. She had a friend, Diana, with whom she had shared a house in their early teaching days. So she moved back down there. And I'm still in contact with various people. It's sad to have lost the Oxfam shop, and to have lost to some extent, to a large extent, the contact with other people I used to teach with, but that was inevitable. So thank you for listening, or reading, however this is eventually produced.